Bola sat on the edge of her king-sized bed, gazing out of the floor-to-ceiling windows of her luxurious mansion. The sprawling estate, with its glistening marble floors and opulent chandeliers, looked like something out of a dream. Her husband, Abina, a very successful businessman, had provided her with everything she could ever want. They were among the wealthiest families in the city, living a life of luxury that most could only imagine. Yet, as she stared at the perfect horizon, her thoughts were heavy. Amaka, her childhood friend, had visited earlier in the day. Amaka was her closest companion, the one who had been with her through thick and thin before Abina's wealth transformed their lives. She had always been supportive, but Bola could sense a shift. Over time, Amaka had become increasingly envious of Bola's lifestyle. Today, her envy had been palpable. As they sat in the garden earlier, sipping iced tea under the shade of the palm trees, Amaka sighed heavily, her eyes wandering around Bola's manicured estate. "I wish I had your life, Bola," she said, her voice tinged with longing. "Look at you. A beautiful mansion, designer clothes, a loving, rich husband. You have everything a woman could ever dream of." Bola smiled faintly, stirring her tea. "Amaka, it's not always as perfect as it seems. Sometimes, I miss the simpler things we used to have. The carefree days, the ability to walk down the street without anyone whispering or expecting something from me. Abina is wonderful, but this life, it comes with its own pressures." Amaka scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief. "Oh, come on, Bola. You don't mean that. How can you miss a simple life when you've got everything anyone could ever want right in front of you? Do you know how many people would kill to be in your shoes?" Bola sighed inwardly. She had tried to explain this to Amaka before, but it always fell on deaf ears. To Amaka, Bola's life was perfection, an unattainable dream. She was convinced Bola's complaints were nothing more than false modesty, a way to appear humble despite her wealth. But Bola wasn't trying to be modest. There was a strange emptiness in her soul that the riches, the grandeur, and even the love she shared with Abina couldn't fill. There was something about the simplicity of her old life that she missed. She longed for the days when she and Amaka would sit on the wooden bench outside her mother's small house, laughing about the little things in life, before all the expectations, before the facade. Later that night, as Abina arrived home from work, she greeted him with a kiss, but he immediately dove into discussions about business. "I have a meeting with some investors in the morning," he said absent-mindedly, as he sat down at the dining table. "It's crucial we secure this deal if we want to expand operations in the new market." Bola nodded, though her heart wasn't in the conversation. This had become their routine. Despite the fact that they loved each other deeply, Abina's life revolved around his business. And while she admired his ambition, Bola often felt alone in the vastness of their shared world. She craved something more than just the material wealth around her. That night, as Bola lay in bed, staring at the intricate patterns on the ceiling, her mind wandered back to the conversation with Amaka. She knew her friend couldn't understand, but there was a deep truth in what she had said earlier. The life she lived now, though luxurious, had taken something from her. She missed the days when she could make decisions without the weight of society's eyes on her. She missed the simplicity of being just Bola, not the wife of Abina, the rich businessman, not the woman whose every move was scrutinized. One afternoon, Amaka arrived at Bola's mansion for their usual catch-up. As she stepped out of her modest car and walked toward the entrance, she noticed a sleek, black luxury SUV parked in the driveway. The car gleamed under the sunlight, its polished surface practically shining like a trophy. Amaka frowned slightly, tilting her head as she looked at it. She rang the doorbell, and Bola greeted her with a warm smile, inviting her inside. But Amaka couldn't stop thinking about the car she'd seen. "That car outside. I don't recognize it," Amaka said as they settled in the lavish living room. "Is that a new one?" Bola looked down briefly before answering, "Yes, Abina bought it last week." Amaka's eyes widened. Really? Another car? Is it for you? Bola hesitated before nodding. Yes, it's for me. Amaka was stunned. Her mind raced with thoughts. This was, what? The third or fourth car Abina had bought for Bola in the last year alone. She quickly masked her astonishment with a smile, but inside, the familiar pang of envy gnawed at her again. Your husband is always showering you with gifts, Amaka said, trying to keep her voice light. Cars, expensive trips, necklaces, jewelry. You're really lucky, Bola. Bola's smile faltered slightly as she poured them both tea. I guess you could say that. Amaka leaned back on the velvet sofa, still marveling at the idea. I mean, I can't even imagine having someone who would buy me all of that. A new car, and you already have two others. Not to mention the vacations you go on, the jewelry you wear, it's like a dream. Don't you ever feel overwhelmed by how much Abina gives you? Bola set her cup down, her fingers trembling slightly. It's not always as perfect as it seems, Amaka, she said softly, almost as if talking more to herself than to her friend. Amaka raised an eyebrow, confused. What do you mean? Bola looked away, her gaze drifting toward the large windows that overlooked the lush gardens. She seemed lost in thought for a moment before speaking again. I mean, all these gifts, the cars, the necklaces, the trips, they are nice, yes. But there are things that money can't buy, things that... She trailed off, her voice heavy with something Amaka couldn't quite place. Amaka blinked in disbelief. Was Bola actually complaining about having too much? To her, it seemed like her friend was being ungrateful for the life she had. How could she say it wasn't perfect? Bola had everything. Bola, I don't get it, Amaka said, shaking her head slowly. You have a husband who spoils you, who gives you all these incredible things. What more could you possibly want? Bola sighed, her expression distant. It's not about wanting more, Amaka. Sometimes it feels like all these gifts are just distractions. Distractions from what? Amaka asked, frowning. She couldn't wrap her mind around what Bola was saying. To her, it felt like Bola was speaking a different language, a language of abundance that she couldn't understand. Bola hesitated, as though there was something in her heart she couldn't quite express. She wanted to tell Amaka the truth, to open up about the things that weighed heavily on her soul, but how could she? How could she explain the loneliness that sometimes settled over her despite all the luxuries? How could she describe the emptiness she felt when Abina was constantly away on business trips, leaving her in this huge mansion, surrounded by material things, but devoid of true companionship? I don't expect you to understand, Bola finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. But sometimes, it feels like Abina's way of showing love is through things. And while I appreciate it, I miss something deeper, something more meaningful. I miss the connection we used to have. Amaka frowned, clearly still puzzled. You miss connection. But you and Abina seem so happy. You've got everything a woman could want. A rich husband, a beautiful home, all the luxuries. What's missing? Bola looked at her friend, feeling a surge of frustration. She knew Amaka couldn't understand. For her, the idea of wanting anything more than wealth and material possessions was foreign. In Amaka's eyes, Bola had won the ultimate prize in life. How could she possibly explain the silent struggles, the lonely nights, the feeling that she was drifting further away from the man she once loved so deeply? I don't expect you to understand, Amaka, Bola repeated softly, her eyes reflecting a sadness that was too complex to put into words. But believe me, things aren't always what they seem. Sometimes, I feel like I'm living in a golden cage. A golden cage? Amaka repeated, now thoroughly confused. Bola, you're living in a palace. How could you call that a cage? Bola forced a smile, knowing that Amaka couldn't see past the surface. She would never understand the loneliness that came with wealth, the isolation that wrapped around her heart like a cold, invisible shroud. To Amaka, wealth equaled happiness. To Bola, it had become a burden she wasn't sure she could carry for much longer. Amaka, unable to grasp the weight of Bola's words, shifted in her seat and took a sip of her tea. In her mind, Bola's complaints sounded ridiculous, almost ungrateful. How could someone who had so much be so dissatisfied? She had cars, trips, jewels, and a husband who adored her enough to shower her with gifts. What more could she want? But for Bola, those gifts had started to feel hollow. Each new car, each diamond necklace, each lavish vacation was like a reminder of the emotional distance growing between her and Abina. They had drifted apart, and despite all the wealth, she was beginning to feel like a stranger in her own marriage. Amaka placed her cup on the table, her voice light with an attempt to move the conversation back to a place of normalcy. Well, I guess if your husband ever gets tired of buying you cars, he can always send one my way, she joked, her laughter filling the room. Bola smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was something deep within her heart that even the best friend she had known for years couldn't understand. How could she explain the emptiness to someone who was blinded by envy? How could she make Amaka see that, despite the riches, her life felt incomplete? That night, after Amaka left, Bola wandered through her mansion, her footsteps echoing in the vastness of her home. She paused in the driveway, staring at the new car Abina had bought her. It was beautiful, sleek, and expensive, everything a woman like Amaka would dream of. But as Bola stared at it, all she could feel was the weight of the loneliness it represented. She realized then that there were things money could never buy, things like peace, like fulfillment, like true companionship. And for all the wealth she had, those were the things she missed the most. Bola's loneliness grew as the days passed, and even though she tried to shake the feeling off, it clung to her like a heavy cloud. Abina was always busy, either at work or locked in his office at home. The mansion, despite its grandeur, felt suffocatingly empty. One evening, feeling the weight of her solitude more than ever, she picked up her phone and called Amaka. Amaka, can you come over? I really need some company. Amaka, always eager to visit Bola's luxurious home, didn't hesitate. Of course. I'll be there in a bit. When Amaka arrived, the two friends spent the afternoon eating, talking, and laughing, just like old times. Bola felt a momentary reprieve from the dull ache that had settled in her heart. It was nice to have her friend around, and for a while, she forgot about the sadness lurking beneath the surface. As they sat at the dining table, sharing stories and sipping their drinks, Bola suddenly winced in pain. Her hand instinctively went to her belly, and the sharp pang that followed made her gasp. Bola? Are you okay? Amaka asked, concern etched on her face. Bola's face contorted in agony as she clutched her stomach. The pain was unbearable, and tears sprang to her eyes. No, something's wrong, she whispered, her voice strained with panic. The pain was worsening by the second, and she could barely sit upright. Amaka jumped to her feet, alarmed. I'm calling Abina. She rushed to grab her phone, quickly dialing Abina's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice distracted and annoyed. Amaka. What is it? Abina asked from his office upstairs, clearly still immersed in his work. It's Bola. She's in so much pain, Abina. Something is really wrong. You need to come quickly. Abina hung up immediately, and rushed down the stairs to find Bola doubled over in agony. His face paled as he saw her struggling to even speak through the pain. Without wasting a moment, he scooped her up and carried her to the car, with Amaka following closely behind. They sped to the nearest hospital, Abina's heart pounding with fear. At the hospital, the doctors did everything they could to stabilize Bola, but her condition was serious. After several tests and hours of monitoring, they realized that she would need specialized treatment that the local hospital couldn't provide. Abina and Amaka stood by Bola's side, worry etched into both their faces. "We need to transfer her overseas for further treatment," the doctor explained. "It's the best chance she has." Abina didn't hesitate. He arranged for Bola to be flown to a world-class medical facility abroad. As the doctors prepared her for the flight, Bola looked at Abina with teary eyes. "Don't worry, love. You'll be fine," Abina reassured her, holding her hand tightly. But inside, he was filled with dread. Bola left for her treatment, and in her absence, Amaka stayed at the mansion. At first, she was simply keeping Abina company, visiting him often and helping with things around the house. But as the days turned into weeks, Amaka found herself spending more and more time at the mansion. Abina, who was emotionally exhausted from worrying about Bola, began to lean on Amaka for support. She was always there, ready to comfort him, listen to his frustrations, and offer her shoulder for him to lean on. Slowly, Amaka's intentions shifted, and she saw an opportunity that she had been secretly waiting for all along. It started with innocent touches, her hand on his arm, a hug that lasted a little longer than it should have. Abina, lonely and vulnerable, didn't push her away. Amaka was attentive, warm, and seductive. She had always envied Bola's life, and now, with Bola far away, she saw her chance. One night, after an evening of comforting him yet again, Amaka leaned in a little too close. Abina didn't resist when she kissed him. The weeks of emotional turmoil, coupled with Amaka's constant presence, had worn him down. He let his guard down, and one kiss turned into more. Soon, Amaka had succeeded in seducing him. From that night on, their affair began. Amaka started spending more nights at the mansion, sneaking into Abina's room when the house was quiet and empty. They kept up appearances, pretending that she was merely helping him through a tough time, but behind closed doors, their relationship deepened. Abina, despite knowing what he was doing was wrong, justified it to himself. Bola was far away, and he was lonely. Amaka made him feel seen, appreciated, and desired in a way that he hadn't felt in a long time. He convinced himself that it was harmless, just a temporary escape until Bola came back. But Amaka had no intentions of it being temporary. She had what she wanted now, and she wasn't planning on giving it up. While Bola was thousands of miles away, fighting for her health, Amaka was building a secret relationship with her husband. What began as envy had now turned into betrayal. Amaka felt no guilt. In her mind, she had always deserved the life Bola had. At first, the relationship between Abina and Amaka felt thrilling. For Amaka, it was the life she had always wanted, being with a powerful, wealthy man, indulging in luxury and having her desires met. Abina, despite his guilt, enjoyed the distraction and the comfort Amaka provided. But it didn't take long for things to change. A few weeks into their affair, they had a minor disagreement. It wasn't anything serious, just Amaka teasing Abina about something trivial. But out of nowhere, Abina's demeanor darkened. Without warning, he struck her across the face. The force of the slap sent her stumbling back, her cheek burning with shock and pain. Amaka stood frozen, her hand on her face, unable to believe what had just happened. "Abina, you hit me," she whispered, her voice trembling. She had never imagined him capable of such violence. Abina didn't respond at first. He simply stared at her, his eyes cold and distant. Then, just as quickly as the rage had come, it disappeared. He walked away without a word, leaving Amaka standing there in stunned silence. The next day, Abina appeared with a gift, an expensive diamond necklace, glittering and delicate. He handed it to Amaka without apology, simply saying, "I got this for you." Amaka was confused, but the luxurious gift dulled her anger. She accepted the necklace, though the sting from his slap lingered. She told herself it was a one-time thing, that it wouldn't happen again. After all, he had given her something so valuable to make up for it. Perhaps he regretted what he had done. But it wasn't a one-time thing. A few days later, they had another argument. This time, it was over something even more trivial. Amaka had accidentally knocked over a glass of wine during dinner. Abina's anger flared again, and he hit her, this time harder. Amaka's lip split, and she tasted blood. She stared at him, wide-eyed, but again, he walked away as though nothing had happened. The next day, he gave her a bracelet, golden, studded with emeralds. He said nothing about the beating, only placing the bracelet in her hand, as if it was supposed to erase the violence. Amaka was beginning to feel unsettled, but she stayed. She told herself that the gifts made up for it. Each time he hit her, there was something expensive waiting for her afterward, a necklace, a bracelet, designer clothes, or a new handbag. The luxury dulled the pain, and for a while, she convinced herself that it was enough. But the beatings became more frequent. The slightest mistake or disagreement would set him off, and Amaka began living in constant fear of his temper. She never knew what would trigger him. One day, she would accidentally say the wrong thing, and his hand would come down hard on her. The next day, he would be calm, as though nothing had happened, offering her yet another expensive gift. It became a cycle, violence followed by gifts. Each time he beat her, he would offer her something extravagant to make up for it. But Amaka wasn't blind to what was happening. She knew something was terribly wrong. She was no longer enjoying the life she had once envied. The lavish presents lost their shine, and no matter how many luxury items he gave her, they couldn't erase the fear that crept into her heart every time she heard his footsteps. One day, Abina's temper boiled over in a way that terrified her. They had another argument, this time about his late-night work habits. Amaka had merely asked him why he was always so busy, hoping for more attention. But instead of answering, Abina flew into a rage. He beat her so viciously that she collapsed on the floor, bruises blooming across her body, her face swollen from the force of his punches. She lay there, gasping for breath, her body racked with pain. This time, she didn't think a gift could possibly make up for it. But a few days later, when she had finally managed to recover enough to leave her bed, Abina presented her with a car. A sleek, expensive luxury car. It was the most extravagant gift yet, but as Amaka stared at it, she felt nothing. The car, like all the other gifts, was hollow, a meaningless token meant to gloss over the violence she had endured. Amaka was confused, hurt, and more alone than ever. She had gotten what she thought she wanted, Abina, the wealth, the luxury, but at what cost? He had no time for her, no affection, and no love. The only attention he gave her was through violence, followed by material gifts that were supposed to make everything okay. But nothing was okay. Amaka could no longer even enjoy the life she had envied for so long. She lived in constant fear of making a mistake, knowing that Abina's temper could flare at any moment. And when he wasn't angry, he was distant, emotionally unavailable, absorbed in his work or elsewhere. Her dreams of living a life like Bola's had crumbled. She was trapped in a cycle of abuse, and despite the expensive gifts that lined her wardrobe and driveway, Amaka had never felt more broken and powerless. And the worst part? Bola was still overseas, unaware of what was happening behind her back. Amaka had betrayed her friend in the worst way possible, and now she was paying the price for it in ways she could never have imagined. When Bola returned home after months abroad for her treatment, she felt a strange tension in the air as soon as she stepped inside her house. Everything looked the same, but something felt off. As she walked through the familiar rooms, she saw Amaka sitting in the living room, her face drawn with guilt and anxiety. The sight of Amaka in her house, and the subtle clues she had noticed since she stepped in, made Bola's heart sink. She wasn't blind. She wasn't naive. She had always been observant, even if she hadn't wanted to confront the reality staring her in the face. The long months away from home had given her clarity, and now, standing before Amaka, she could no longer ignore the truth. With a calmness she didn't expect, Bola confronted her friend. Amaka, she began quietly, why are you here? Why have you been here all this time? Amaka's eyes welled with tears immediately. She knew she had been caught. She didn't even try to lie or deflect. Instead, she broke down, confessing everything to Bola, how she had seduced Abina, how she had stayed in Bola's home while she was overseas for treatment, and how the affair had spiraled into something she could no longer control. But then, with a trembling voice, Amaka explained the darker side of her experience, the beatings, the manipulation, the cycle of violence followed by lavish gifts. I'm so sorry, Bola. I didn't know it would be like this. I thought I wanted your life, but I didn't understand. I didn't see how unhappy you were. Bola listened, her face calm but her heart heavy. When Amaka finished speaking, Bola shook her head softly. You never understood, she said. You were so busy envying my life, so busy wanting what I had, that you never stopped to think that maybe things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Amaka looked down, her guilt overwhelming her. I thought you were ungrateful when you told me things weren't easy. I thought you were just pretending, making it seem like your life wasn't perfect. But now I see it. I understand. Bola shook her head, her heart aching not just from the betrayal but from Amaka's naivety. Amaka, those gifts, they were never signs of love or happiness. Every car, every necklace, every trip, they were apologies. Apologies for the way he treated me. They were sorry presents after every time he hurt me. You thought I was living this glamorous life, but all those things were just meant to cover up the bruises, the pain. Abina never gave me those things out of affection. It was all to make up for the terrible way he treated me. I tried to tell you, but you were too busy envying what you thought I had to see that I wasn't fine. I was lonely, miserable, and trapped. Amaka looked up, her tears still flowing. I didn't know. I didn't see it. I thought you were just being modest, like you were downplaying everything. Bola's eyes softened, but her resolve remained firm. You weren't listening to me, Amaka. I tried to tell you that my life wasn't perfect, but you wouldn't hear it. And now, look at what's happened. You've betrayed me, and for what? Do you feel like it was worth it? Amaka shook her head vehemently, her voice choked with regret. No, Bola. It wasn't worth it. I thought I wanted his attention, his gifts, but it came with so much pain. He beat me. He hurt me, just like you said he hurt you. Every time he hit me, he would give me something expensive afterward, like it was supposed to make up for it. I couldn't enjoy any of it. I was so afraid. Bola felt a mix of sadness and vindication. She had been in Amaka's shoes for years, and now her friend was living the nightmare she had tried to escape. But Bola wasn't the type to gloat. She sighed deeply. Amaka, I've always tried to help you. I rented a house for you, gave you money, supported you whenever you needed it. But this is unforgivable. Amaka's sobs became uncontrollable, and she fell to her knees in front of Bola, clutching her hands. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm so sorry. I was blinded by envy. Bola stepped back, her voice soft but resolute. Amaka, I don't hate you. But I can't stay here anymore. I've made up my mind. When I was overseas, away from Abina, I realized something: I can live without him. I've been so close to death, and for what? Poisoned in my own home, and I don't even know who did it. I don't go out, I'm always here, and the only people around me were you and Abina. At the mention of the poison, Amaka's face drained of color. Her tears stopped, and a look of horror flashed across her face. She burst into fresh sobs, confessing through her gasps for breath, I'm so sorry, Bola. I don't know what came over me. I was so consumed by jealousy, by wanting your life. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Bola felt as if the floor had been pulled out from under her. She stood still, stunned by the admission. You poisoned me. Amaka, I've done everything I could to help you, and this is how you repay me. With poison. Amaka could only cry harder, her voice breaking as she whispered, I was lost in envy. I'm so sorry. Bola shook her head, her voice cold now. You can have him, Amaka. I'm done. I'm leaving, and I'm divorcing him. Without another word, Bola walked upstairs, packed the few things she needed, and left. The betrayal, the violence, the years of enduring Abina's temper, it was all behind her now. A few days later, Bola filed for divorce. When Abina found out, he couldn't believe it. He had always thought Bola would endure, that no matter what he did, she would stay. He tried to win her back, apologizing, offering her more gifts, houses, cars, even promises of a life together free from his temper. But Bola refused. I have everything I need, she told him. I'm done. With the divorce settlement and the money she already had, Bola opened a successful business. She thrived in her new life, free from Abina's control and the shadows of the past. Her business grew rapidly, and she found happiness in her independence and the peace she had craved for so long. Meanwhile, Amaka, consumed by guilt, left Bola's house and disappeared from her life. She couldn't face the weight of what she had done, the betrayal, the poison, the envy that had destroyed their friendship. Abina, on the other hand, spiraled. He tried to move on, dating different women, but none could tolerate his behavior. Eventually, he married a woman from a prominent political family. The first time he laid a hand on her in anger, she had him arrested. After 3 days in jail, her father intervened, warning Abina that if he ever touched his daughter again, there would be dire consequences. Abina's life became a living hell. His wife refused to divorce him, using her father's power to control him. Every argument, every attempt at violence was met with a threat, and Abina, once so powerful and mighty, found himself trapped. His wealth and influence couldn't save him now, and he realized too late that he had lost everything that mattered. Bola, meanwhile, flourished in her newfound freedom. She had everything she needed, not through apologies or gifts, but through her own hard work and determination. She was finally at peace. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please like, comment, and share the video. Also subscribe to our channel, and click on the notification bell, so you won't miss our next video. Bye bye.